The Pioneer Taiwan Studies Workshop is designed to bring together a generation of Taiwan scholars, mostly anthropologists, who performed ethnographic fieldwork in Taiwan as early as the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. At that point, Taiwan was meant to be a stand-in for China, but as we'll discuss throughout the workshop, we believe it was also the point where Taiwan studies began to emerge as a separate field. When Niki first raised this idea to Bill Lately at the World Congress of Taiwan Studies in 2022, and then later communicated that to me, we were just really intrigued by this idea of bringing together all of you, just a kind of a legendary generation of scholars to discuss the impact that you've had on the field of Taiwan studies. Later on, when we were discussing this, we initially thought of doing a world history project, and then we discovered that Dominic, who was actually at the World Congress and spoke with Niki about this, didn't tell us about the world history project that he'd been working on for 10 years. But once we discovered that Dominic had been working on this for a decade with Derek Sheridan and Dominic Yang, that we thought we should just have this as a way to kind of be maybe even a capstone kind of workshop for your oral history project. And so we very happily invited Dominic, who came here on a very busy semester. And we now have that physical volume, that oral history volume, which I've scanned, or one of our student assistants scanned and have shared with everyone. So we hope that by bringing us all together, we can revisit this important historical period. We can discuss how Taiwan studies emerged as a field and reminisce about old times. So I'll pass it over to Niki for your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm going to keep it very brief, but absolutely, I'm truly thrilled that you all agreed to come here. This was just the kind of idea that I'd see many people and at different times, like at the World Congress, we're there together and we're bringing together these different generations of people who have worked on Taiwan, who are working on Taiwan. And for me, coming from my own background of both as a graduate student and MA student at National Jinju University in Taiwan, where I first kind of come to learn your work, and then as a PhD student at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, continue to use your work in informing my own research, and I now have the privilege to pass that on to a new generation of scholars who are interested in studying Taiwan as an island. So for me, the idea was really this is a workshop about kind of bridging these kind of generations, and for us to think about the future for Taiwan studies. We all know that we kind of sit in interesting times, particularly when we think about the future of Taiwan itself. But Tom Gold once said that Taiwan studies exist and it will forever exist no matter what happens. And I think the idea is that for us to then think about, okay, so what is the studies and how did it come about? And this is really what today is all about. It's about passing on knowledge, sharing our thoughts, and I'm truly kind of pleased that you are all here today. I have so many questions that I want to ask you individually, and I shall do so through the course of the next couple of days. But for now, I'm going to hand back to James, who's going to talk us through the program before we hand over to Dominic to talk about the oral history project. So thank you.
Dominic Yang is Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Missouri, Columbia. He specializes in Chinese Civil War trauma, memory politics, and identity formation, in particular, ordinary people displaced to Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek's regime in 1949. His book, The Great Exodus from China, Trauma, Memory, and Identity in Modern Taiwan, won the Memory Studies Association First Book Award in 2020-2021. His latest research examines memorial landscape and transnational justice process in contemporary Taiwan and Cold War refugees produced by the Taiwan Strait Wars between the US, Taiwan, and PRC. So today he will discuss a book that he is a co-editor of, Studying Taiwan Before Taiwan Studies, American Anthropologists in the Cold War. So he co-edited this volume with Derek Sheridan and Dominic Yang. And this was just published. So that's why we had a slight delay in getting the scans to all of you, but hot off the press. And so let's welcome Dominic to speak about the oral history project in the book.
So the book just published this year by the Institute of Taiwan History and Academia Sinica, and it's both in English and Chinese. So because we want it to be read by as many people as possible. And also, I would like to take this opportunity to thank some of our, people that have accepted our invitation for interviews. And if, you're from the same generation, you haven't received any invitation, it's not because we think less of your scholarship, right? It's because, I'll sort of, explain how this project sort of developed organically out of one of the NASA conferences that I am involved with in 2014. And the reason, if we have enough people that actually wanted to participate in this project and we have enough time, we could have basically interview everyone. Because that was the plan, really, to have, more books like this, multi-volume. And we talked with Tai Shisuo with the Institute of Taiwan History about this, and they're very interested in it. Now, here comes the part in which I apologize because, yes, there are 3 editors for this book, right? But the most important person is definitely Derek Sheridan, the first person. And I have apologized to Derek on several occasions, like privately and also in other occasions, but I'll do that again here on record. It's recorded, right? So Derek, sorry, I sort of dumped this on you, and because I'm the person who wrote the initial research proposal, I'm the one who I play that role because I was the president of the North American Taiwan Studies Association at University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2014. And this project came out of that. Like after the conference, everybody tired, we look at the beautiful lake and there's we're all sitting, picnicking and, talking about our future because back then none of us had a job and we're struggling, right? Where there is this thing called China Studies and there's no position for Taiwan Studies for most of us, right? We're trying to understand how that, we have no indictment against, people who do, we just want to understand the structure of knowledge production. That because we understand that this thing came out of the Cold War, that before the Cold War, anything about, and this is not only about China, East Asia, this is about the United States, and the Western world's racism against everyone, right? These cultures are now worth studying. So before that, and I actually had a very long talk with my colleagues, Victor McFarland at University of Missouri History Department. His specialty is Arab studies, and he told me the same thing happened, right? Before War II, it was mainly the missionaries and the children of missionaries. It's like John King Fairbank and the China Studies, because those are the people who have the language capability. It was really after the war that you had this structure put in by the government. And we see a lot of that in the oral history. Now, again, when we started this project, right, we just have a little bit of vague understanding. So, one of the things that came out of this book is that we, for us, the people who want to do Taiwan studies at this time, we come to really sort of appreciate how that entire field developed and the people who are involved in it, right? And so you see, when Derek and me were working on, this project, because Derek, he's an anthropologist, I'm a historian, right? We are trained differently, and also because this is about the anthropologist. So he usually has a lot more anxiety. I mean, he doesn't really want to ruffle feathers at the people that because I read these work as well, but not to the same extent that Derek read your work, right? And the kind of respect that he actually had for all of you. So there's just something that's really, now I'm going to sort of, in order to basically, because I prepare a lot of stuff and there are things I want to talk about. We can't talk about this entire book because it's, and one of the things I want to, again, the opportunity to thank, especially, Dr. Harrell and Dr. Gates, that people are actually on, that accepted our invitation to do that what we thought were the first book. Now it's the only book, right? Because my apology is that I sort of, in the middle of it, like I admit that I sort of abandoned the project a little bit because I got this position at University of Missouri. It's pretty demanding, and then you need to really publish that first book, and so that first couple of years at University of Missouri was very hard for me. And also 2 years later, Derek got his job at Institute of Ethnology and Academia Sinica, and so I thought that he could take on more responsibility, and it's this process of negotiation between two of us, Derek. And I think at a certain point, I even said to Derek, like, you should take my name completely out of this, right? Because for the people actually who did the interview, like I was going to do one of the interviews, right? But then I back out from that as well because I just simply did not have enough time. But by that time, we already sent out people that that interview the interviewees in this book, right? And it's already started. And I said, Derek, I don't want to be in this book. You should take the credit for it, but because he's the one who basically, look at most of the. Of course, I did some of this with him, right, and wrote that introduction. But he's really the one who basically just painstakingly just edit the. We do have the interview manuscripts. And also, in terms of the final manuscript that's approved by all of you. So thank you all again, and thank you, Derek. Okay, I owe you big. Okay, now let's talk about the origins of this book project. The origin actually comes from this event that I, in the history of the North American Taiwan Study Association, there are different, like we call it differently. For me, it's called the oh shit moment. Oh my God. This is because North American Taiwan Studies Association was an association formed mostly by students from Taiwan. The founding president was Lin Jialong. He's now the Minister of Foreign Affairs, right? And so, but for most of the first 10 years or dozen years of the NASA history, it had only one single sponsor, and this person was Huang Huangxiong. Okay, so long story short, I was in a 2011 meeting, and for me, that was an eye-opener because my background is a little bit different from most of the students who participated in this conference because first of all, I came from Canada, not a U.S. institution, but this is the North American Taiwan Association. It includes Canada and probably Mexico. Okay. And also that, I was a 1.5. So my family immigrated to Canada when I was 13, 14 years old. I grew up differently. And, how I come to Taiwan, I went to UBC. My teachers were all like, specialists on the PRC, right? Like Tim Brooke, Tim Cheek, Glenn Peterson. Peterson is the main supervisor because at the time he's working at all these overseas Chinese who return to the PRC to help now build the new China, right? Of course, later on they all end up in having all these very bad experiences during the Cultural Revolution. We thought it would be interesting to do the reverse direction, but let me say this. This doesn't come from Glenn Peterson or any of my mentors at UBC. They didn't prevent me from working on Taiwan, but and this is not only from them, but the people that I talked to that actually are senior scholars in the Asian studies field, they all advised me not to do Taiwan studies. If you you're a historian, and if you don't really, because I've been the PRC several times in the early 2000s, like it's a great place to, like I climbed the Great Walls, I went to Sichuan, and they have the place they did do the panda thing. You can hug the panda for like $20 US. I mean, that's all fun. Like I have lots of friends who work in China. I can visit them, but the thing is, for me as a historian, right, I think democratized Taiwan is a better place to do the work. Archives are like open or in the process of opening. So I wasn't really, and And so anyway, like, and they said that, well, if you want to work, work in the archives of time, totally fine. Academia Sinica, good place. But you got to do Republican history, right? Like history of China before 1949. Anything beyond that, that's not. And again, I have to stress my supervisors at UBC. They're great scholars, right? I learned so much from them. And for that, I'm forever appreciative, right? And this is not only coming. They have only the interest of my career in their minds when they make those advice, and they're really good advice, because to this day I'm still disadvantaged in a certain way. Because if you look at the job market, right, my field, China after 1949, nobody's going to hire someone who do Taiwan. Like, they're always going to go for the PRC, right? And it's and this comes from everyone else, right? So, and that's something that. So I learned that before this crisis, right? So this crisis, the reason I know like I'm a little bit all over the place, but the reason why I want to talk about this crisis is because that it is intimately it's very closely connected to the making of this book. Because what came out of this crisis, so from about 1912 to 1914, so there were 3 presidents, but the 12th president was this person, right? So I actually took this photo from. We recently had a 30th anniversary dinner, and this is just about a month ago from that. And you can see Lin Jialong in the middle. See the person sitting right-hand side of Lin Jialong, that's actually Huang Hongsheng. And I could not be in this meeting because, I have faculty responsibilities here. But the thing is, I'm so happy to see this photo, because when I was the president in 2014, Xiao Xinhuang, Michael Xiao, took me to Jiantayuan to see Huang Hongsheng, not for him to come back to support NASA again with his foundation, but just to invite him with our own money. We want to wine and dine him. We want to acknowledge him, but he said no to me. And he's never been, and also Lin Jialong, we invited him. He didn't want to do it, but I'm so happy now it's happening. It means that we're doing something right? So the other person I show here is Chris Liang. Of course, you see Jeff Howe and all these people that you know. You probably know some of the people there. But it was Chris Liang. He was the president in 2012, right? He's the first one who needed to sort of come up. Now the students need to do fundraising. Really, we need to. And so, but that's also the time when NASA really becomes more professionalized. So one of the institutions, so long story short, one of the institutions that we get to support us was the Institute of Taiwan Studies. And as one of the, and of course, there's this other book that came out of the, it was so there are actually 2 books. One is this, it's a Chinese book about NASA's 20-year history. Right. And of course, I was one of the editors. And this is actually the 14 photo. You can see me. I said I'm going to show some photos to some of you. And back in 2014, I was 20 pounds heavier. You can see that just like, right? My wife's like, are you sure you're going to show people this? But anyway, so a lot of the, you can see Bruce Jacobs and Thomas Go. It's the person that James should know very well. But so anyway, so Chris, it was actually Chris, 2020 president, and Rohan, she's actually in this photo. And let me show you Rohan. So Laura, she's the, you see all these people what I work with, during the 2014 NASA 20-year anniversary conference at Wisconsin Medicine. Most of them are professors right now. And so Matthew, he was a student of Myron Cohen at Columbia. And so it was Matthew was the program director. So we have the president and the program director. That's how the NASA system works. President is about like public relations and fundraising and public facing. The program director is actually about like coordinating that entire program. So anyway, although Matt, he was not one of the people who decide to work on the project, he did a really good job in sort of especially introducing us to Myron Cohen. And through that, we get to talk to, and of course, Myron gave us a lot of names, and also Michael Xiao, who also provide us with a lot of, people that we can sort of interview. So you can see that everything, and this is, from here you can see Edward Freeman and Myron Cohen. They're not here, but they're at that conference. And it's actually at the conference we first talked to Freeman and Cohen to say, we're thinking about doing this, right? Do you think this is a good? And you see Michael Shell there, right? Just asking Freeman a question. So a lot of the stuff, like the initial ideas about this book came out of this conference. It's not part of the conference, right? But it's like private conversations, and especially after the conference, so that's Derek. So Derek and I, Matt West, and all these people who basically, because not everyone participated. We talked about the possibility of doing it, and that's also the time when I don't think Xie Guoxing, the director of the Institute of Taiwan History and Academia Sinica, was there, but Michael Liu, who's no longer with ITH right now, he was there. And he's also very important because we talked to him. I know Michael Liu since the days in Taishu, and he and I had a very good relationship, right? And we talked to him about the project. We actually got him to, he stayed a couple of days with us, with the students, because he and Xie Guoxing was at the time thinking about providing, they knew that we lost our big sponsor. They're about supporting NASA, and they're pulling in also Institute of Sociology and Institute of Ethnology, and also Institute of Law was involved, and political science was involved at a certain point. So, and we're thinking about, and in order to persuade their colleagues, of Taishu, which is also, dominated by people who would not study North America, but Japan, that we come up with. So we already talked to him about, all of this. We're interested in finding out. And Michael Liu was like, why don't you guys put that in a proposal? And he's like, Taishu may be interested in publishing a stuff like that, if you guys can, get your things together. And so this is the origins of the project. I know, it took me some time to explain it, right? But this is, and of course, Derek at the time, he was still a PhD student in anthropology at Brown University. He didn't have a job, but at the very beginning, he took on very heavy loads. So we have basically decided that, because we have meetings, mostly online meetings, as we're everywhere in the States, and some people return to Taiwan for their field work. And when we do, so all of us kind of made a commitment to do this as a side project, other than the things that we're doing, like job search, trying to publish our first articles and whatnot, just because we all have a sort of a vested interest because of this shared experience of the difficulty of navigating waters here in North America, being sort of an East Asian study scholar, but concentrating on Taiwan studies, right? And so this is where, and again, this is where it all boils down to, right? And so the scholars that are actually in this book, there's 7 of them. Of course, Edward Freeman, he's not an anthropologist, but we decided that, because he, promised early on to be in this project, and we thought that what we really wanted to, the reason why we chose the anthropologists is not because that we discriminated against other people. We just saw, because these are the people who really need to learn the local languages, right? Like one of the things that you'll find that by reading the reflections, and I got a lot of that from Dr. Harrell and Dr. Gates, right? You learn this Mandarin and Stanford program, whatever you're in, in Taiwan, it's people don't speak Mandarin here. It's and if you go to Hakka village, they speak Hakka, and most people like just speak like Minnan or it was called Minnan, or now it's called Haplo on the streets or in the countryside, right? So this is but Freeman was a person who also know this, and he had very deep engagements. Especially, he helped some of the political dissidents in Taiwan, where a lot of them were Taiwanese, right? So we basically decided to include him. And so I highlighted two of the interviewers. Of course, Derek should deserve, I would say 80% of credit for this book, but also Chi-Chi, Peng Chi-ting. Now, Chi-Chi is no longer in academia. She's now a government official with the Minister of Economic Affairs in Taiwan. She's in one of the she's to a certain degree still an academic. She's in one of their think tanks. But these are and I think Zhen Qi, Justina Huang, and Agnes Xiao, they're also, not in academia, but the rest were they're all professors. Wei Ting was one of my Xuedi. Wei Ting was the person who interviewed Dr. Harrell. I bet some of you know Wei Ting because he still comes down here from time to time, and he's struggling a little bit. And it's something that really, again, for me, I really shouldn't complain. I'm relatively successful, and also against the students of my cohort at UBC, we all do China. Like I'm not against. Part of my field is China studies. So I have no problem against people who do China studies or the PRC study, and they're all 10-book students, right? But I'm successful than most of them. Okay, so I shouldn't complain. But for a person like Wei Ting, I mean, it's just like, what happened to him after he graduated, just like, it's a shame. It really explained why we have this drive to understand this knowledge production structure, right? And this is so I'm getting into the book now. I know that it's already been 20 minutes. What about the book, right? So as I put it here, as aspiring scholars of Taiwan facing dim job prospect and a very strong presence of China studies in North America, we have lots of questions in our mind. We talked about this among us, right? And especially about the AAS structure, right? Taiwan, Hong Kong, and to a certain degree, study of the minorities, right? The Mongolians and the Tibetans and more recently the Uyghurs. They're all part of the China Inter-Asia Council. Why? Why single out China? And just as it happened, the name is recently changed, right? to East and Inner Asia. So yeah, we do have some still sounder minds, people in the AS, but it took them the longest time, right? And also, we would like to know, again, as I put it, the history and knowledge production about Taiwan, China, East Asia, in America, in American and Western academies, broadly speaking. This is what drive this project. We're not Hung and Mori. We don't have an axe to grind. Like at the very beginning, I actually, as a historian, I didn't even know the book exists until Derek said, hey, you should, since we're doing this project, right, you should read this book. And he was referring to the 2005 book, in which I will sort of mention, in the next slide. But I haven't read the original one in 1994, 1995, but maybe some of the people here can enlighten us to that book, to the content of that book. We're interested, and this is all in the initial conversation that we had about this project. We're interested in role play by the states and the Cold War ideological conflict, how that shaped the knowledge production, and also how political social factors, larger economic trends, the debates within Western academies and in particular anthropology and social sciences, and how that basically also sort of shaped the sinology, the production of knowledge about East Asia, about China, and also the funding structure that shaped research questions and directions of the field. And yeah, we are at the very beginning. I mean, this is, you might look at this as well. So you are thinking about these questions, and this is why you ask these questions, and the scholar responded in a certain way, and this is what you're getting, right? I mean, some people might take it, but there's really, there's like multiple rounds of discussions, and we did some initial interviews with the scholars to see what kind of, because when you're doing historical research or field work, right? It's kind of like sometimes you have to. It's like Deng Xiaoping's where 摸着石头过. You know what kind of questions are actually important, and these are in general the kind of things that we're thinking about. And the use of oral history interview as a methodology. And in short, what we try to do in this book is to try to conduct our own anthropological study of the Western anthropologists. Okay, if you just put it that way. And so why anthropologists, right? I think and I told, Barbara Harold this earlier when I spoke to Barbara, right? For exactly the kind of things that Barbara Harold talks about in her memoir, we want to see, these anthropologists as, they're all brilliant scholars that have accomplished so much in contribution to the production of knowledge in China, East Asia, and also about Taiwan, right? But we want to know something that's more private about their lived experiences, things they're intimate to them, daily interactions with the local Taiwanese that they met, and we want their personal agency to really come out, all these details, and the reason why we might not be so interested, because I talked about maybe some of the historians, people are like, man, well, they're all like, they're in Taipei and they're all in academia, Sinica, reading all these historical documents brought by, yeah. Sorry, Professor Ebri. I don't know, maybe you can, speak on that, that's not true, like we all have like, all these like interesting conversation also with local people as well, but that's our bias. That's what we're thinking, right? The anthropologists, they live among the local people. These are foreigners, and they're basically foreigners trying to fit in. And I think that's one of the aspects that Barbara talks about in the memoir, right? They try to engage with local communities that live in the mountains or in the countryside. Their testimonies can be, and this is from a historian's perspective, right? Their testimony can become valuable primary sources for the study of Cold War Taiwan. And this, we basically, in terms of, Taishi's publications, like, they have very high standards. Right? They're just not going to let us, like, we're a bunch of graduate students, right? None of us have published something of note at the time. But that's the I think that the last point is the argument that sort of won them over, because we not only have to win over the approval of Liu Shiyong and Xie Guoxing, but also their colleagues, right? We're like, all right, Hong and Mari, and of course there's this book, right? Yeah. So this is, this is the big elephant in the room, but I'm going to talk about it. And so this is my reading, right? So this came to me in the middle of I'm gonna be mindful of time here because I want to. So we have until 11:30, right? Okay, yeah, it's okay. I can still talk about this for like 10, 15 minutes, and we still have a good discussion. Now, so these are the things that are actually accused that Hong and Mori, that that book, which I think all of you have read, that accuse American anthropologists of, I just put it like, I don't know, conflating Taiwanese and Chinese culture, searching for traditional China, focusing on topics such as kinship, family, marriage, child rearing, religion, instead of the more serious issues such as politics, ethnic tensions, and social inequality. American scholars, in some sense, advance the KMT Cold War agenda, promoting Taiwan as cultural China or the real China. This is not from us. This is Hong Mori, okay? Abandoning Taiwan when the island democratized and turned to another authoritarian regime in search for a more exotic or more authentic other to study. And in doing so, American anthropologists, especially Arthur Wolf and their students, yes, sorry, I mean, some of you here, that, through the collective scholarship, collude with the KMT to bolster the idea that Taiwan was part of China and hence contribute to the suppression of Taiwanese identity and nationalism, and we're still helping to legitimize the PRC's territorial claim on Taiwan. So have I missed anything? Okay, have not, right? Okay, but that's not how we think, especially after we have interviewed people, right? So this is actually from Dr. Harrow himself, right? That self-reflexive article, which I find, I didn't read that until, so when I saw that, when Dr. Harrow sent it, I was like, okay, this is good. So again, we'll talk more about that the second day of the conference. Right? So I'm just going to basically, quote from Dr. Harrow. It is clear that Taiwan ethnographies of the Golden Age. So Dr. Harrow called this period of 20 years from the 50s to the 70s, the Golden Age, before the army moved to China, right? That is directly tied to the, carry a series of biases that could directly tie to a politics era where Taiwan was China, and perhaps even more so to the theoretical climate of anthropology before its incomplete revolution in the 80s and the 90s. And of course, Dr. Harrow will talk about it, the three main problems: cultural holism, adaptationalism, and synchronicism, which, yeah, I think they're all like legit criticism. And also, and these are like just other people's view. And you know what? I do agree with, in particular, with what Sylvia Lin and Joe Bosco says. I have it there, and I'm just going to read the highlight part, right? And the authors, Hong and Murray, appear to ignore the possibility that anthropologists are also products of particular political and cultural and academic system, as we all are. And we're not, we're also prisoners of our time, right? And so their research was partly determined by an anthropological trend and partly by political situation on Taiwan. It does not represent deliberate conspiracy to eschew Taiwan society. Yeah, we do agree with that point, right? It is a little bit too harsh. And I was, just telling Dr. Weller that, the most that you can say, if you want to be really sort of critical about it, right? The most you can say is some sort of complicity. But if you ask anyone who's doing research in China nowadays, it's like, come on, that's the most you can say, right? But saying that there is this conspiracy or collusion, I think that's something that's, that's not justified, right? So, and this is Joe Bosco, right? And he says that the polemical and combative and tendentious tones, the tendentious tone of the book gets in the way of exploring the important issues of anthropology's relationship to powerful authoritarian states. Yeah, that's so true. Because, that's one of our conclusions by looking at what happened in Taiwan from the 70s to maybe some of you here won't agree with me, but this is our collective opinion. Like looking at that experience and look at what's going on with, Western anthropology or academia's engagement with the PR. I'm not saying that every engagement is problematic, but we do really need to think about how that entire structure of the exchange, how it sometimes is just don't want to get your local collaborators in trouble. The fact that they're sending so many students here to our universities, maybe we won't have that event about Tibet, about Taiwan. That's a little bit, it's usually the other side didn't ask for anything, but you just self-censor. I know it's sort of harsh, but looking at what happened on Taiwan, it's a great lesson to us all, right? And this is what Joe Bosco is saying, right? By presenting the book that way, they lose legitimacy and make it impossible to talk about these issues. Now, what we learn from this is our reflections, right? After we sort of complete the project, we look at it, right? We think that structure did shape scholars and that era of scholarship. That really goes without saying. But people are also thinking individuals who make different choices. Things usually develop organically and serendipitously. There might be some silence and complicity, but definitely not collusion. There were, in fact, what we see, again, you can say, well, this is these scholars reflecting, and people tend to defend themselves. But, as far as we know, that there wasn't really any, sort of intention to hide anything, as, I mean, when you have Dr. Gates talking about, how she developed that relationship with Arthur World, people are really forward about, I'll get to that point. Right? That's one of the, because that's such a part of the book that's so interesting. I'm going to leave it till the end. All right. And there were, in fact, consideration that work, against acts and considerations that work against U.S. imperialist interest in Taiwan. There were also efforts to assist local dissidents, such as the actions of freemen, or at least some degree of empathy towards those living under the thumb of the KMT dictatorship. We saw a lot of that, right? And this is really contrary to what Howard Murray is saying. We learned so much, so I'm very appreciative of, what you're willing to share. And for me as a Cold War Taiwan historian, right, I learned so much, really. All these insights, and understand how area studies develop, how the funding structure work. And again, this is, if you want to sort of reform the AAS, that's the discussion about the language learning dynamics, which I think some of the participants here in the workshop can talk about it, in the later workshops. This really deep and organic engagement with, different parts of the Taiwanese society, having young child in the field, the health of that child. Right? I mean, all these are kind of insights that, this book, like I don't have time to talk about the stuff that's in this book, right? But it's just so interesting. And city versus the countryside, like it was like, countryside Taiwan in, I was educated, for us, Taiwan Center historiography is the thing, right? I wasn't a Taiwan Studies scholar until I got to Taiwan, because my UBC training didn't give me a lot. So that I got a lot of that from Institute of Taiwan History and understand the entire structure, but that structure is also biased in a way, right? And I get to see that. There's different perspective. And for me, like, it was like, oh, I thought the Taiwanese cities were like having all these like dynamic Hoklo people, and they're a lot better than those guys, the mainlanders living in the cities. And no, the Taiwanese countryside were very underdeveloped, right? And people didn't really talk that much about the 228, right? That was not important for them. What's important for them is stuff in their daily lives, whose daughter's getting married and how much of the money that the hongbao you're getting, right? And the guy's next door's wife is, like the neighbor's wife is having an affair, stuff like that, right? And that's as real as it gets, right? And there are all these like interesting things that are actually, that I would say that people in academia, Sinica nowadays, like running the Taiwan Studies Institute, is actually missing out, really. And and I feel that most strongly, because I had this, I know that I should probably be wrapping this up, but I tell you an anecdote, because I had good relationship with people in Institute of Taiwan History. This is recorded, but it's okay. I don't care. That I talked to, but the moment I said to the people in Institute of Taiwan History that, for my PhD project, I want to work on the mainlanders, because back then I really wanted, because I'm a Taiwanese family, right? My family member who died from the 228, right? So we're as deep green as we can, but I really want to understand the mainlanders. Why? The present-day mainlanders seem to be not remorseful, and they have their own narratives, right? And that project for me was very personally satisfying, because I get to learn the other side of the story. But the thing is, the moment when I said that in Taishizuo people, although we have very good relationships still today, they're like, no, we don't have anyone who can help you. I said, why? This is the Institute of Taiwan History. And they say yes. And the mainlander history is part of Taiwanese post-war Taiwanese history, isn't it? They say yes. But you don't have anyone here who can work with, because I'm a graduate student. I really sort of need something to say. No, you have to go to the Institute of Sociology. And they said Institute of Modern History here won't help you either. And later on, I learned why, because I had very interesting conversation with people over there as well who study from Ming China all the way to maybe 1949, 1950. They don't touch anything after. They say, well, that's too recent. And I said 1949 is already 75 years. Okay. Didn't historian have this like 50 years rule? Again, as we look at, like how structure shape people and stuff we should study, not study, it was like, there's like this and that. No, you have that structure over there, right? And that's why, and that structure also reproduced that's why, before my book came out, there's really, except two others. So one of the Malone Meyer, I don't know if he did his degree here. With the exception of that and Joshua Fan, there's really nothing major of a migration that is like 1 million people, right? And it's the biggest event ever. Yeah, there are hundreds of books probably about the Chinese Civil War and Chinese Communist Revolution. There's not one single book, but like again, you can see where I'm coming from, right? So anyway, let me sort of, can I go for another 5 minutes and we'll move to discussion? Are we okay? Are we still okay? Okay. So again, these are the things that we talk, and this is something that I had this conversation. So I'm going to basically jump, this is something from Dr. Hurrow again, but he's going to talk about this, I suspect, right? So I'm going to jump through this slide because this is about the anthropology of the Taiwan society, that book, which, Dr. Gaze is, close involved with. And this comes from Zhang Maogui, someone who I work with he's really my mentor for the mainlander studies. And he's a sociologist, okay? But originally, that department was merged with Institute. That came out of Institute of Ethnology. So at some point, he was at Institute of Ethnology. This is what he told me personally, okay? He said that your article, Dr. Gates, where you look at the differences between the mainlanders and the Taiwanese, and saying that there are two different ethnic groups separated by two different political economy, the system, right? This is something in Taiwan that cannot be talked about, right? Back then, right? This turned a light bulb in his head. And also that light bulb also went up in some of the colleagues that actually in the Institute of Ethnology. If you know anything about Zhang Maogui, he's the one who wrote the 4 major ethnic groups of that 政策白皮书 for the DPP in the early 1990s. And he told me that there are 2 main inspirations for that. One is that this book, and also in particular, Dr. Gates' article, that chapter. The other one is his former colleagues, Hu Tai-li, who's also an anthropologist in the Institute of Ethnology, Academia Sinica, who is the first person, anthropologist in Taiwan, to do field work on these Laobing, the veterans, the sort of disadvantaged nationalist veterans are in Hualien or in eastern Taiwan now. And so that's one of the things about this book, right? And that particular, so again, you never know, when you sort of create knowledge, what's going to happen, right? This is way beyond, and the other thing, there's just the endless interesting thing in this book that Derek and I and people participate learn. And this is in particular to the field of anthropology, because the anthropology is the study of the other, right? And this comes really straight from Dr. Harrell's chapter, I think. But I think, some of others also, like Myron Cohen, also talked about this. It's like, because we asked them, like, do you have, what kind of relationship do you guys have with the local scholars at the Institute of Ethnology, right? And it's really, at the time, dominated by these giants of Chinese anthropology. It's like Li Ji, Rui Fu, and all these people were still alive. They started a career in mainland China, right? And the thing is that Li Ji, Lui Fu, and those people, they're into the study of Taiwan, the indigenous, back then what they were called Shanti Tongbao, right? You know, the indigenous population, Yuan Zhumin, we call them today, right? And there's this very interesting thing is that because the American or Western anthropologists are mainly interested in the local Han Chinese culture. And by that, they mean the mostly Hoklo and Hakka culture, the religious temples and rituals and everything. And for people like Li Ji, Rui Yifu, and all these mainland elites, right, who came out of the May Force movement in China, they look at that as like, that's superstition. That's backwardness, right? Why would you want to study that? Okay, if your Westerners are interested in that, that's fine, but this is not what we do in anthropology and it's because of how the other was sort of envisioned by these two, different groups of scholars, right? And and there's another point I want to make from that is that so there were not a lot of collaboration between foreign and local scholars in Cold War Taiwan, other than the political factors, right? And because and this the phrase I put in green, right? I'm thinking about writing a book just on that idea, and this is something that I learned from reading this narrative and that discussion, right? There's so much discussion about KMT being a colonial force on Taiwan. And of course, that's pretty new. And of course, maybe one half of the Taiwan people are actually in the blue camp. Okay, they're not one half, maybe 1/3. Would strongly disagree with that idea, right? We're not a colonizing force. What are you talking about? This is the ROC. And Taiwan is the ROC. But if we're going to have that conversation, right? What is this colonialism? How is it different from Western colonialism, Japanese colonialism? I think if you approach it from the point of view of the other, right? Yeah, the local Taiwanese were others, but they're others in time, not others in race and ethnicities and culture, but in time. So, and this is the Chinese sort of colonial mind, right? The reason why you can see all these differences and say that we're all the same Chinese nation is because you are me. You're just me. Like the Taiwanese and Hoklos, yeah, you are me before the May Force movement. You still live in Qing Dynasty. For the local savages, you're me, like 5,000 BC. Yeah, because you're so hunter-gatherers. Okay, that's okay. I get that just from reading. I don't know, maybe that's too much, but I need evidence, right? Okay, but again, that's why I enjoy so much about this project. Now, let's end with this, the love story. Okay, maybe Dr. Gay didn't talk, but when Derek and I read that, I was like, two of us were looking at one another. Can we publish this? I asked Derek, did you like personally write to Gate and say that and ask her that, and you tell us it's totally okay? So long story short, I mean, you will eventually get your hand on the book and be able to read about this. So the thing is so long story short, it's basically because Dr. Gates, when she's in Taiwan, is basically persona non grata, right? But people at Institute of Sociology and people at the Anthropology department of Taida, right? But they made a mistake of inviting you to one of these big conferences in the 1980s, the kiss-off conference between Taida and then Academia Sinica, because these two anthropological departments had just so much conflict, right? But then the secretary is making all these arrangements, putting you in business class flight and put you in that big hotel in Taipei. She made a mistake, right? Because she put you on, so you were put on a list of not to invite, right? But she made a mistake of inviting you. So then the kind author will, just basically, maybe you can tell that story better. But long story short is that the reason why you started that relationship because author promised, made a promise to the conference that he will watch over you over the entire conference, and so he had to spend a lot of time with you, and then you absolutely charmed him, right? Okay, you will tell that story better than me, so I'm not gonna take that away. But when I was like, oh my god, yeah, that's great. So
Yeah, but there are also things that we don't get. We sort of, one of the initial goal was to see how basically experiences and knowledge production of Taiwan later on get transferred to China and sort of influence Chinese anthropologies. Later on, we did get some of that, right? From each, some of you talked about a little bit more, but we have a sense we didn't get a lot from those kind of things. So anyway, I mean, so I guess that's, sorry it took me a lot longer to finish what I want to, anyway, I don't want to talk about Bruce Elman, but that's when I still have time. I want to talk about, how to actually influence my project with the Taiwan History work, but we don't have time. So I'm just going to end there and we can go into the discussion thing. Thanks, guys. Thanks for bearing with me.
Feel free to jump in.
I think I should speak.
Yes, by all means.
I get to be second.
Of course you do. I just wanted to say that the poem passed around was for Arthur Wolf's birthday party in Taipei quite a long time ago. And for those of you who do not have an American background, childhood, perhaps makes no sense at all, but I will give you one hint. The hint is that Cornell was the good place and Stanford was the bad place, okay? And Harvard, of course, was. The other thing I wanted to say very quickly was that the big influences on my life in academia have been Arthur Wolf, but also Eric Wolf. And frankly, Eric Wolf's influence was greater. I just wanted to add that little note.
You talked about that at the beginning of your narrative.
Okay, I will.
Yeah, you did talk about it.
Good. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Harrell.
Well, I should be Steve for this conference, really.
Okay, Steve.
Okay. The real Dr. Harold is over here.
Oh, shush.
But,
Very lovely.
it's interesting. It was like these topics of identity were not topics of research when we were, in the village, but they came up in interesting ways about who was the other and what is anthropology and what are the managers. And I just want 3 quick stories. When we first moved in, there was a guy living out back who was a habitual drunkard, but he was quite educated actually. And I think he'd fallen because of alcohol. And I said something about, studying anthropology. And he said to me, as he figured, because all foreign languages were Japanese to these people, no, 人類学者ですよ。世の中に住んでいる人、チンファナと言わない。And I said, none of itいいですか? And he says, 高山同胞. This was already a sort of awareness that this was a sensitive topic. You shouldn't be using these ethnic slurs, which is what we call them now. You should be using the respectable Kuomintang term, which was Gaoshan Tongbao. And, it's a trilingual conversation with a village drunk. But another thing was, I remember, and I don't even remember exactly who said it to me, but I was in the middle of one of these evening bull sessions in the middle of winter when things are cold and all I can do is sit around and kind of, chat. And we were talking about the Kuomintang and there were mainlanders in the village. And this guy says, 大了嘅共產黨，我這邊嘅國民黨，咁樣能嘅兄弟也不怕。The communists on the mainland and the KMT over here, they're just like two brothers who don't get along. And that was, I think, was a common village thing. On the other hand, I remember the son, one of the sons of the lady whose house I stayed in 1978. He was, he was a high school graduate, and he was saying, 非常的反对这个台湾独立。 我想台湾独立的话，我就去跟国民党插上游击队。And this is a you know, a son of the village, right? And you know, Taiwanese person. And the last thing is that you know, there were mainlanders in the village, and they were absorbed, married in to poor families. They somehow refused to learn to speak Taiwanese. I got favorably compared to them, you know, by the time I've been there for about 2 months and didn't speak it very well yet. And still it was better than they did. And they were really the lowest of the low. But if they behaved themselves, it was fine. You know, every day, you know, they were here and you had your job and I had my job and I helped with your wedding and you helped with and so it was a very and people used to say, you know, uncomplimentary things about Sinica. But you know, they were there and people got along just fine most of the time.
Yeah, and I think that sort of picture of complexity, right? You just move forward of us. It's actually, you know, it's in a lot of aspects, different aspects of Taiwanese society. And I think, you know, for me as a historian, right, because we don't really read a lot of that in current work, and also from the way the entire, you know, this is my opinion, the entire field of like post-war Taiwan history. It's, you know, it's too politically oriented. Like I'm not saying, like I myself was doing like white terror research. I'm not saying that's not important. But the thing is, like you neglect social and cultural history. You know, like actually how like power relationships work on the ground in different ways, right? And this is the kind of things that we're really into, like historical realities. And I guess, you know, one of the contributions, like you are like giving that testimony, to be able to really sort of illustrate that for all of us. And I also remember like Stephen, when you talked about, you say that when you learn, you know, Chinese at the Stanford Center, so that's actually in Taiwan back then.
Yeah.
And there are all these, there's a very small circle. So yeah, you know, Dr. Gates, you're there as well, right? There's this small circle of mainlanders, mainly from Beijing, because you can't say Beijing. You can say Beijing, you're going, right? And they live in this little cocoon of like, you know, getting very nostalgic about China. And then when it's like, you know, like you guys are like, oh, we want to go learn this like local languages. Oh, you don't need to do that. Everybody speak Mandarin. All those kind of things that, you know, we would like to, again, like me as a specialist of Cold War Taiwan history, would like to basically know more about, right? There are different research methodology, and again, I am not saying that oral history is completely, because my book, one of the memory studies, it's about like critically looking, you know, like oral history as memory and the memory politics. So I understand all these problems, but then, you know, just having this produced, having you give that testimony, really, you know, sort of provide some of these, you know, I would say window into these, you know, insights of social interactions. Dr. Will, do you want to say?
So I have a quick observation on this, and then an unrelated, well, related to what you said, but unrelated to this topic, question for my elders. The observation is we probably all have stories very much like the ones that Steve just told, complicating stories, but ones that also show the how tactile that those ethnic issues were for all of us. I mean, I had those. I was at Sheridan and Linda Gale Rodrigo's wedding. Like, but this is all stuff I felt at the time I couldn't write about, and didn't even want to write down in my notes, so as not to endanger anybody. And that, so this idea of working under authoritarian rule, and what does that do to us? And even if you don't, your heart might not be complicit, but if you want a career in this place, there's compromises that you have to make. So that was the observation. The question for my elders is about the assertion in there that that the Golden Age people, of whom I'm not sure, I'm either at the dying last gasp of the Golden Age, or I'm into the Bronze Age. Or I'm not sure what year it is.
Bernie Gallen and Rita Gallen were the first ones, and Arthur.
Yeah, so that
What
could
year do
begin.
you go?
1976 is the first time I'm there. My dissertation started in 77. But for me, I was really close to a lot of anthropologists at the Minzu School. Like really, there's a lot of them who were super helpful to me, and the sociologists too, actually, Xia Xinhua, Zhang Mahui, Qu Haiyuan, the people, right when it was they were all in the Minzu School at that point. Like that the ancient generation of Taiwan and anthropology. Now, there's all people I knew from there. Not the Taida people so much because I was the Zhongyuan people, and you couldn't do both. But I was really close to them. I went to talks there. I gave a talk there. I learned a lot from them. So the question for my elders is that assertion actually true? That is, were things changing when my little generation showed up, or was that not so true?
My response is I had the least powerful patron of all graduate students. There was a lot of feeling from a few people about G. William Skinner and Arthur Wolf's students, that they dominated everything. They had all the good stuff, and we were just. And I had the least powerful patron because Norma Diamond was exactly like myself, a sort of a bitchy lady. And she published things that nobody wanted to hear. So, it was partly who your patron was. And you had a good one, but maybe not as good as the original generation.
Right, so mine was already diluted, but yes, I see your point.
Well, I think the EN was and Chen Lu were the two sort of main. I mean, there were older people around, like Ray, who was still around. I never saw Martin Yang. I met. I remember him coming up to me after a talk, and my name is Martin Yang, and I remember my reaction. I just met Santa Claus.
Yeah.
And they weren't taking an active part, but Li Yan was a he was such a mentor and patron to so many people. He was also an austere person. He was not the sort of person that was easy to engage in casual conversation. I thought, he was very formal and austere and so on. But he was incredible.
But he was generous and helpful.
Of course, Wang Tzu-ching was basically kicked out of Taiwan because he had a Japanese wife and he had connections with Taiwan nationalists and so forth. And so he ended his life in Hong Kong, and of course didn't live very long, only 56. But no, they were incredibly helpful, and other people, the same way, people of my generation, particularly the Fu Tai Li talked about. Maybe Taiwan's greatest anthropologist, I don't know, but certainly a really, really important figure.
So you guys will sort of disagree with, because what we said is actually there's sort of the separation between what people actually do because of the different views of the other. But you guys are just add another dimension, saying that on the ground there are good relationship and collaboration with most of the Taiwan scholars, with the exception of your person, the group that considered person non grata. Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to mention all these elderly people are in a much better place to talk, but I just, before I forget, Wan Shiqing. So he's not an anthropologist, right, but he's a prominent Taiwan historian. He's
Steve's
Taiwan teacher for some time. And last time I visited Sanxia with Wan Shiqing's son, Dr. Wen-liang. I didn't know that you had a different Chinese name.
Oh, yeah.
I'm like, what? We didn't know that, but they knew you as that Chinese. Anyway, Wang Shiqing, he helped so many anthropologists from America, from Europe. Wang Sifu, Professor Wang, how to pronounce the last name?
Forschland.
Because I asked my husband
Forschland.
about that, the German.
Forschland, yeah.
Yeah, and his son preserved, because Wang Shijing has all this, it's amazing, he kept everything, right? The diary and everything, so Haishan Center, they published his Jiaji Wu as part of social history. And then it's also tied to intellectual history because he had helped so many scholars, either finding field sites or learning Taiwanese language and history. And his son preserves, now inherits all the, and he sends us on Facebook
Every day.
letters between his father and Arthur and other people. I've seen John's name card and maybe yours too. They're all preserved. So in that sense, I see the connections between local scholars, but he's not in Minzuso. He was right. He was in Wenxian.
因为我台湾文献会，还是说，
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. One, of course, there was some reference that not everyone in Taiwan is anthropologists. There's a lot of people say, especially historians, I mean, there's maybe some economists and so on. There are a lot of oral histories and memoirs that have already been written. So if you wanted a kind of introduction to the larger group, because a lot of these people are no longer living, you would have to, there is a big group. So you can go back to Paul Cohen. Of course, he's written stuff that's published. There's a Fred Wakeman, has 400-page oral history from the California system, has a big digital archive, and they've interviewed Levinson's widow. Interviewed a lot of these people. So there's a lot of people who were of that generation. And a couple of things I would bring up. So they often lived together. So I think like Paul Coleman, John Israel, and Lloyd Eastman all shared a house. And of course you had a general maid and a cook. They almost always have two servants in the house. But a couple of things I would bring up. One, it'd be interesting to get this group of anthropologists. The number of the men who marry women they meet there. I'm not sure how to break down whether they were mainlanders or, but it's a high percentage. Maybe the anthropologists don't do this as much because they're supposed to mix with local society. I'm not sure, but I think it would be good to get some anthropologists to
Not the
talk
ones
about
in
this.
this room.
Yeah, but I've been at meetings like art historians where Bob Harris says, well, the one thing that James Cagle and so and so and I all have in common is we have Chinese wives. I mean, it's very common in the field across disciplines. The other thing is once we're getting past 1966 or so, if you read these memoirs, anti-war, that is against the U.S. war in Vietnam, is a much bigger thing than KMT versus CCP, really, for Americans, you know. And so that was not in the stuff that I read so far anyway in this, but if you wanted a bigger picture, I think you have to bring that.
Thanks for those wonderful perspectives, and especially the Wakeman, Levinson.
Right, there's a ton of them. Mankell.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that they.
Yeah, there's a. If you haven't seen it, the Chinese historians in the U.S., CHUS, they call themselves. They're really well. It started as a PRC, foreign students in the U.S.
Yeah, I
But
know that.
Luhan Chao
Yeah.
has done all of these interviews. I think his interviews are mostly not recorded, but email exchanges, but it's presented as an interview. And they are interviewing mostly the Americans. That is, they're not so much interviewing each other. They're interviewing established Western scholars. But a lot of them would be interesting. And you'd find that older group that were still around and active. And he started doing that, I think, before 2000.
But for most of the people that are actually in the local Taiwanese, local mainlander households, we're all Taiwanese.
The mainlanders didn't mind marrying local.
And yeah, they also didn't mind marrying, like, because it's actually a necessity, because you just have to change your balance. I just saw those topics are extremely, I just want to point out that contrast. And both of them are a very extremely interesting topic to look at. Do you have anything you want to say about the domestic health issue that
I had two comments about domestic health. One is that these maids were often approached to spy on their people they were working for. That was one risk of having a maid. And people weren't aware.
They all came from like the mainland or
I don't know where they came from, but my impression at the time was that mainlanders were, there was a network of mainlander maids. We call them amas. And supposedly it was because Westerners, mainly Americans, liked their food better than Taiwanese food, which at the time was mainly boiled fish. I mean, it was a soup. A soup, yeah, it was a soup.
Parfaits on the bottom.
Exactly. And a lot of Americans just couldn't eat it. And so they hired mainland, you get a maid from Sichuan or Hunan, it was fabulous. Shandong, ours was from Shandong in 1970. But I think there was some of that going on. It wasn't because even of Mandarin versus Taiwanese, it's food.
I have a couple of observations. I worked in the South, and it's a very different world from the whole northern area. So I rarely saw anybody from Academia Sinica. When I originally got the sponsorship from Academia Sinica, when I first went there, my contact was Inez de Beauclair, who hated Li Yan because he threw her out when he finally had a position because she was 1,000 years old and she was senile. She was a charming woman. And I can tell you lots about, she was absolutely charming. She was a duchess whose family had lost their properties in the First World War. She had fascinating stories about fleeing the Japanese takeover as she flew up through Vietnam into Western China. She was fascinating. And she eventually retired to Tainan, in fact, where she connected to an historian, a graduate student, so far right-wing that he was actually a monarchist, I think, named Harvey Molay, who was ingenious, wonderful, charming man who went into the leather briefcase business eventually. But anyway, so it jumps back just a little bit further in time. But one of the people in the South who was working there was Christopher Schipper, whom some of you may remember, who had actually was practicing as a Taoist priest. He apprenticed himself to a Taoist priest. His advice to me, one bit of advice when I first met him, was get the hell out of here and go to Ilan or someplace so far away from me. But his primary, if you really want to learn Taiwanese, take a mistress. That was explicit advice. Don't just sit there, take a mistress. I don't know how many Westerners may have had such advice from somebody. Maybe some of them, who knows?
And some of them married.
Some of them married. Who knows where this all came from? In the South, one of the institutions that I visited frequently because they had a nice library and they were very nice people. There was the Taiwan Theological College. So this is the English Methodist world that had been in Taiwan through the late Qing Dynasty into the Japanese period. They were just celebrating their 100th anniversary at the point where I was there. It's the oldest university in Taiwan, but was not acknowledged by the government as being a university, so that nobody would say this is Taiwan's oldest university, but it was the earliest one. With a beautiful compound and people there were two things that were going on. One was that you had Westerners who had been there into the Japanese period sometimes. It was a wonderful, and that would be a wonderful source of potential interviews, was the staff who had been at the Taiwan Theological College. There's another one in the north that was I think Taiwan Theological College or something in the north. But the Tainan one, I think, is probably a better source for interviews and people having retrospective memories and things. And they have a library. One of the things that bothered me through the first couple of decades after I did field work in Taiwan back in California was the tendency of Americans talking about ethnicity in Taiwan to equate it somehow, in some way, at some angle with black-white relations in the United States. And you could not get them off of that stereotype. There was a trope about blacks and whites in the United States that was imposed constantly on Taiwanese ethnic relations. I think maybe it's a thing that Americans impose on interethnic relations around the world, just kind of routinely. It's the stereotype that we have available to us. And maybe it's appropriate somewhere, but I think mostly it's not. And explicitly trying to make the comparison might help, but explicitly recognizing that there is this menacing stereotype waiting to get at your mind. I think maybe something that American scholars in particular, and especially those who haven't spent very much time in Taiwan, who have been there only briefly, tend to bring to it. All right, those are my observations. Taking mistresses, stereotypes in your mind. That's right. Inevitable Claire being a duchess, whatever.
David or Dr. Jordan, what will be your interpretation or portrayal of the village or the community that you work on in terms of the relationship, how people perceive differences and how they treat one another? Were there a lot of,
we had no mainlanders in the village at all. Yeah, there were no mainlanders.
No mainlanders at all.
I was looking, when I was originally looking for a village, I was looking for a village that would be in the sort of Dowda Jane belt that runs along the south coast. And I didn't really want to complicate the thing with a lot of urban-rural migration. I wanted as stable a population as I could get, because I was really looking for sort of established things. My secret interest was religion, but what I had to do was a research proposal for my department as a graduate student was something based on literature. There wasn't much literature in religion. I was convinced that Taiwan and China were quite different places. So I wasn't really educating myself in Chinese religion as well as I should have. And the result was that I ended up writing a research proposal that had to do with families and family life and so forth. And then when I got there, yeah, they had families, but that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was when the families married ghosts. There you've got something. So the result was that I was thrashing around, looking at stuff that was different from what I was actually prepared to be looking at. It's true, I had fun and I didn't make too big a mess of it, I don't think, but it's quite different from the experience of this multi-ethnic complex thing with kind of political pressure on it in the north. In the little village I was in, there just wasn't very much of that. It was much more relaxed, much more laid back. People were, as I was reading your book about all these fights that were going on in Plowshare, I don't think I ever saw anybody raise a fist against anybody in Taiwan. They were nice people. They were all being nice to each other. And I think maybe in retrospect, they were probably completely conning me, but I wasn't important enough to be worth conning. So I think they were just much nicer people than other people were. I don't know.
I mean, have you ever, asked them about their sort of opinions of, other people or even the indigenous people back then?
When I ask about Aborigines.
Yes.
Okay, there was some intermarriage with people. I remember going to a bye-bye that was an Aboriginal bye-bye. How was it different from a Taiwan bye-bye? Would you use betel nut? That was it. That's the whole difference. This is a little bit like, the big thing about being Muslim is you don't use pork for you worship the ancestors.
So now
and it was regarded as sort of it was not like being left-handed or something. It was just not relevant to anything very much. They knew there were mountain people, but they didn't have anything to do with them. There were mainlanders. The local policeman was a mainlander. He was a nice man. He spoke Taiwanese and everything. Nobody worried about him. He was a policeman. He did his job. It was fine. And when you went into the city, of course, there were mainlanders. And I remember riding along on my motorcycle with a friend, and we stopped to ask some instructions of the policeman. And he's asked in Mandarin, and I asked him afterward, how did you know to use Mandarin instead of Taiwanese. And he said, you can tell by looking at them. And actually you can.
Yeah, we
a
could
lot
tell.
of the time. And so, okay, you can tell by looking at him, and he could tell, and he was very sensitive to this. Another time, on another bit of field work, I remember riding along on my motorcycle with the Taiwan. We went out to Mulan, I think, and came back. And he said, I really like these junkets out there. I like to hear the sort of rustic accent. And I couldn't hear an accent to save myself. What do I know from an accent? But he was very sensitive to that. And I realized that I just don't have the sensitivity that my local people did. The sort of eye-opening event was something. My Taiwanese was terrible. My Mandarin was not very good for reasons I can go into later, but want to go to the Sanford Center. If you're not a student at the Sanford Center, they kick you out really fast. They won't sell you a book. They won't tell you what books they're using. They are the most hostile, vicious, nasty people in Taiwan. They do not want people from the University of Chicago to go anywhere near the Sanford Center. And so I was quite unwelcome at the Stanford Center. It was different from the theological seminaries. They're very nice people. They'll say anything. But where was I going with this? Pardon me? Oh, yeah, I couldn't get. There was a family in the village. The man was deaf and hence mute, and he hung around peripheries of things, but he participated. They had two little kids who couldn't be in school because they were also deaf mutes. We lived at the opposite end of the village, but I realized as he was participating in something, I realized I'm not a deaf mute. I speak a little bit of Taiwanese. I speak a little bit of Mandarin. I don't have any idea what's going on. He doesn't speak anything, and he knows what's going on. There's an awful lot of culture that's going on that you absorb without language. And it was a lesson I just learned, you gotta look, you gotta watch, you gotta feel. It was, all right.
Those two points are actually, I think, David or Dr. Jordan made two very important points. The first is that, since this cultural term or linguistic term, whatever you want to call it, humanities, social sciences, or postmodernism, there's so much emphasis actually put on language itself. And everything comes from language. Analysis of language. But what you're actually supposing, because the old school way is, you don't listen, you can listen to what people tell you, but it is actually the anthropologist's observation of what people are actually doing to one another, and sometimes things are actually beyond language. But maybe we can talk about Dr. Stephen talks about this kind of shift in the scholarship, because I think there's really a lot of things that can be done, really. I mean, from that period, whether or not this kind of sort of, if you want to be called regime or truth or knowledge system that we're on here, is basically something that it's far superior than the previous framework. That can only be talked about. So that's what I get from this. And the other point I think is that's also pretty interesting and important is that we shouldn't, especially for me, historians, go back with this ethnic framework sort of developed basically after democratization, because I know where it comes from. And so this is not to say that there's no, in any society, there's unequal populations, and we all know that structure, right? But in terms of how different communities lives in different places, so even the small islands, Taiwan, have all these diversities, and how people really interacted. Again, this is what this oral history project's all about. If we basically retroactively take the kind of ethnic framework that we have right now and to understand that history, actively search for all these kinds of things, we might not, like for me, like the biggest fear of, you know what, in this day and age, I think despite postmodernism and post-colonialism, whatnot, historians are still, one of the missions is looking at, rediscovering or uncovering historical reality. This is still our job.
Okay, I think we have, two people. The thing was Dr. Xu and then Yize, you want to say something or?
Well, if I can.
Okay, so Dr. Xu first and then Yize.
Just a very quick anecdotal observation from the raw field notes, Arthur's field notes. When I was working on the book, I was also naively wanting to see if there's any sort of intergroup dynamics among children, because there are a couple of mainlander families. Maybe one was married into the House of Lin, their landlord family, the Taiwanese family. But there is also one who's kind of a school teacher, and there were a couple. And I was trying to see, and those are raw observations of children's behaviors. And I, coming from scholar of social cognition childhood, I do believe these very mundane things tell us a lot about human nature, going back to Arthur's theoretical inclination. But I didn't find that much. Part of it is sample size limit, because there aren't many mainlanders. But I do find, from the children's behavior, there is no real antagonism between the children who are from families who have been there for a long time versus those from mainlanders. Just a couple families. I mean, sample size from, but I do find that the children were throwing stones to. There's a couple newcomers from Jinmen, because it was 59 and 60. So there's after the Taiwan Strait crisis, I assume some people moved. Yeah, thanks to the book that I read in James' class, the Cold War Taiwan. And there was throwing stones to the Jinmen boys, newcomers. And also there is a Western village. The Xiaxizhou is a small village. There's a Western village. There's a lot of antagonism between children from Xiaxizhou and the Western village. So the intergroup relationship is very complex, and you can see it from just echoing back to your point and see your observation of the complexity. For me, what's fascinating is the underground, very ethnographic and even mundane materials. But I would love to know if there are more, from a child development angle, if there are more materials I can find in that period. I would love to, develop a sort of follow-up project on that political socialization and things we had talked.
Not that early.
Okay. Yize, I think you have the final word.
Oh, I'll be quick. Hi, I'm Yize. I'm a visiting scholar here at UCLan. I'm teaching in Taiwan in National Taiwan University in the Indigenous Studies School. So I have two very kind of simple or superficial questions, but I have that in mind for a while. One is about the choice of not studying indigenous people, even though we said about this kind of a background of taking Taiwan in the Cold War era as possible access to the China study. But is there any concern at the time not studying indigenous people, particularly division of labor? Maybe Japanese scholars doing that and American scholars doing Han society. I'm not sure. I want to learn a bit more about your concern. And the other is the readership of your works publication, because nowadays when we are teaching, back to the book, I think it's a very timely observation on how Taiwan study been coming up. It's an interdisciplinary study. But now when we are in anthropology, we don't study ethnology, we don't study religious background. Some of your work were studied by the religious studies. Some of your work were studied by sociologists, but not as a Taiwan study group as one. So I was wondering, how do you imagine your readership at the time when you were writing all these studies for either Taiwanese reader, for the American reader? How would you imagine the Taiwan studies readership at the time when you publish your work? Those are two questions. Thanks.
An important point is that not long before began an argument whether anthropologists could study peasant societies, because peasants, we're supposed to study the various kinds of Gaosanzhu, and sociologists got the big countries. Well, Eric Wolf was one of the people, Sidney Mintz was another person, and we figured maybe it was okay to study Chinese people. But that was really a big deal at one point.
I think there may have been some restrictions on foreigners going into those areas that made it almost impossible to get into them. Another issue may have been the fact that Japanese was sort of lingua franca, and most of the Americans who were preparing to go to Taiwan did not know any Japanese. So they couldn't really control the background literature, and they also couldn't talk to people in those areas. Mandarin was coming into the school system, so you could talk to people. By the time I was there, I remember visiting Aboriginal villages, struggling to suppress an anecdote. But I think there may have been obstacles that you might want to look into that would have made it impossible for foreigners to get into this island.
I'm not so sure about that. Kim Kwang-wook, who's Korean, but he was a student of Morris Friedman, did a thesis very early on a Turoko, a tile, which is a very nice piece of work, and is still highly valued by Scott Simon, who now works among the Turoko. And I'm delighted to find, I didn't realize you did indigenous studies, but I'm someone who sort of transitioned out of Han studies into Pingpu studies and study of Soraya. So, well, it's not Gaoshanzu, it's something in between. And, I think very much worth studying and very much a part of the history of Taiwan. So, I evolved into this kind of interest. I arrived as a student of Arthur Wolff and Bill Skinner's, interested in Han society, land tenures, but it evolved into something else.
Kim Jong-un was not an American.
I know
think
that. I'm aware of that.
Of course, you know that. and
But
I think
I
that's
don't
one of
think
the
that
reasons
well, he probably knew Japanese.
that would be helpful, but he was not an American, and that's a good reason.
Well, for whatever reason, he's a student of Morris Friedman. How did
Who
that
wasn't
happen?
in
Right. I just wanted to point out the first Anglophone scholar, not American, obviously, to do work on indigenous people in what is now thought of as Taiwan was Edmund Leach in 1930.
Yeah.
The structure of the natives of Hotel Tobago, which is another name for Hong Tao. It's just, but the other thing I was thinking,
Those in the
it's
Japanese.
controversial whether anthropologists should be studying peasant society, because Malinowski in his later years was encouraging people to do that. He was, and then he died, and I don't know, from the British anthropology standpoint, but
Well,
certainly
Fei Xiaotong.
encouraging field work in Mexico and
Something
in
to
the
Fei Xiaotong.
What?
Fei Xiaotong,
well, yeah.
right? Because he's a student of Malinowski and was obviously
One more
urged
thing
to do
about
that.
the cultural connection, Murray and Hong in particular, but a lot of Taiwanese nationalist scholars are trying to draw as broad a line as possible between Taiwanese culture and Chinese culture. But two things. When I first went to the borderland between Sichuan and Yunnan, I went to a funeral. And I could understand everything from that funeral because I'd read Arthur Wolff's Mourning Dress article. You can't deny the fact that these have common roots. And I don't think you have to. I remember 1996, there was a debate before the presidential election. And Li Donghui refused to participate. So it was Deng Min and Liang Chan and one other. And they were really into this identity question at that time. And Deng Min said, oh, you call me Zhong Hua Min, so no problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You understand who said it, so they're talking about political context. They developed a political context where you had to try to differentiate Taiwanese culture from anything that happened on the mainland of Asia. And, the contrary thing is if you go to Quanzhou, there's this incredibly elaborate museum called the Ming-Taiwan Boulevard, right? The Museum of Minnan or Fujian and Taiwan origins. And, you know, it shows all the commonalities and it goes through the history and the history and the history. Stops at 1949. Nothing after that.
Okay, I mean, we should wrap up this, first workshop. I would like to thank everyone. This is a great, discussion. We'll, likely, two things. One is that we sort of hope that this can continue, like over lunch and everything. We'll continue to discuss this for 2 days, right? The other thing is, I mean, this is the final sort of my final point of response to Dr. Carroll. I mean, of course, I came from that Taiwan Center of History topic because that was my engagement when I get to Taiwan in the early 2000s and start Taiwan Studies. And over the years, I just, when I teach PRC students, I discover a strategy in which I'll say, well, they always say, well, you are, your main languages are like Haplo and Mandarin. You are a Chinese person too, so how can you say Taiwan is not part of China? And I said, well, politically it's not. I mean, that's reality, but I can very confidently say, we have Taiwan subjectivity, right? But you know what? It is not Taiwanese culture as part of Chinese culture. But Chinese culture is a very integral part of the Taiwanese culture. I can say that to you because Americans and Australians and Canadians are very different people. And they all speak English. Okay? All right, so let me end on that.
And love the Queen.
Yeah. Okay, let's end on that.
All right, one more round of applause. Thank you.